All right, cool. Thanks for joining, everyone. Is the screen, you should be seeing an observable notebook. Is the screen and text big enough for everyone? I'm gonna close the live YouTube so I don't hear myself delayed by 3 seconds every time I speak. And this link should be available in Slack, but I'll just post it again. This is the link to the observable. So today we're going to be looking at how data can be passed along amongst selections in D3. And as some of you may have run into, the way that D3 kind of keeps track of this data can be like one of the trickier things with the library, but it's also really quite useful. And I do recommend looking at this article. Goes over in some nice detail some of the differences, in particular between the select all function and the select function. But in a nutshell, if you use a select, you basically maintain the same parent that this selection has. So this is can be problematic if you're trying to create a nested HTML structure. You are going to ultimately want to have another select all within that, even if that second select all has a single element. But in our case, we are going to be looking at tables specifically, because the homework for this week is doing things with tables. And for this example, we have our data here, and you see it's a list of objects, and each object has the name of the product, so apples and bananas, as well as some aggregate statistics about those products from, say, a list of costs at different supermarkets. And just to open this up, we have basically the outline of a table here with the header information pre-populated, and then the body of the table starts empty, but it has this ID of table body example. So if we go in here, this is all of the code necessary for D3 to populate this table, which is pretty cool. It's nice and concise, but it's important to understand how the data flows between this. So let's just go through this sort of line by line. At the beginning, we're selecting that outer table, sorry, that empty body element within our table. And then the first thing that we do is we bind the data that we're calling produce list. So the data at this point is this list of these 4 elements. For each element, we want a row in our table. So we're going to do a dot join, which will do all of the like enter, exit, merge stuff for us, but essentially ensure that there's going to be one TR or row element for each object in this produce list. So up to here, this is like pretty standard to all of the sort of select all data joins that we've seen so far in class. But after this, we have this nested select all. So your first select all is getting a list of table row elements. Now for each one of those, you're going to get a selection within that. So it's almost like a list of selections or a selection of selections, or a nested selection. And for each one of those, we're going to make a call to this data element. So when you call select all, the data is maintained, but remember that at this point, if we were to do something with the D element, that D element would be this entire object. And when we start looking at this row above, we want these 4 attributes, the product, the min cost, etc. So when we set the data, one thing we can do is pass in a function that is going to transform this data element D, which in this case is this entire object, and it's going to return the list of things that we want. So in this case, it's really just kind of repackaging this data in a format that is amenable to D3. And D3, when you do these select alls and joins, it's really expecting, you know, some type of list or some sort of like iterable thing. And that's what we're doing here with these square brackets. We're saying this is a list, and we just have these 4 elements within it. And once we have those 4 elements within it, we can do this join, and we set the data. And at this point, this D element is now one of these elements in our list. And it's gonna, you know, when you join, it's gonna create 4 TD or table data elements. So it's gonna create these 4 cells, and it's gonna populate them, the text with these values that we've put in here. Are there any questions up to here on this sort of nested structure here? Cool.
So does each line get a TR element? So like Apple gets a TR element, and then each TD element would be like the Apple, then the 243, then the 415, then the 689. Is that what that is?
Yeah, so easiest thing to do probably is going to be just look directly at this T body. So this is that body element that starts off empty. So at the beginning here, we select that body, and then we add these 4 rows, those 4 TRs, and we add 4 of them because we have 4 objects in this produce list. And then for each of them, there's going to be 4 TDs. And if we go into the next one, you'll see banana, 0.23, et cetera, et cetera. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so that D fat arrow, then the list, that makes a new one for every single one of those entries.
Yes.
So each one gets 4 TDs, not just one.
Yeah, so this join is making sure that your TDs, the number of your TDs, is equivalent to the number of elements in your list. And this is the list. So this list has 1, 2, 3, 4 things in it. So therefore there's going to be 4 TD elements.
So it still does get 1 element. It's just that 1 element is a list that happens to have 4 pieces.
Yeah, yes. Are there any other questions? Cool. So I have also commented out this code, and I just want to point this out because this this syntax is doing the exact same thing as this syntax. And you may also notice that these select alls have a different indentation. This is not, you know, a typo here. This is something that I do intentionally sometimes to separate out these different selections, because it can get really easy to get mixed up with what selection is what. So in other words, you know, if you do this first select, that's going to return your first selection object that contains the body. Here, we are using this selection. So, you know, with the chaining syntax, it's using everything that's evaluated up to this point, and it's creating a new selection over these TR elements. And the thing that makes this tricky is that, you know, if you do something like set the background here to, you know, blue, whatever, and run it, you can see nothing happens because this should be style. Yep, and it looks terrible. But the point is, with certain things like the style, it will use this selection on all the rows, and then it will return the exact same selection object. So it doesn't modify the selection anyway. Versus here, now that you're done with all your styling, if you call this line, it will use, again, that selection of row objects, but it's returning an entirely new selection. And this new selection is a selection of like the cell objects. So that's just what I'm doing. I'm going to delete this just so they're totally equivalent again. That's all I'm doing here. But I'm just making it a little bit more explicit, where I do chain these selections, but I create this row select, and then I end the chain, and then I create this cell select using that row select, and sort of have a new chain. And this is kind of just a stylistic difference, but I find it useful myself sometimes just to like help myself keep track of the different selections and chaining that is going on. Any questions in the distinction between these two chunks of code?
I was curious, for the .data and you pass the function, do you have to pass a list? Is that?
So so in general, when you bind data, it expects a list of things, right? And in the case where you're doing this nested selection, we are actually passing it this entire function. So this the syntax is saying we're going to give you a function, and this is, you could call it a modifier function that takes in the data that was already previously bound to it, and then it returns a list. So in this case, we're constructing that list on the fly.
Okay. Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Any other questions before we move on to the first exercise?
I'm curious, when we want to translate each to enter and exit statements, if we didn't use John, we want to use the enter and then exit. So how does it look like?
So your question is this overall syntax, this nested syntax, how would it look with enter and exit?
Yes.
Instead of with join?
Yeah.
I mean, it would really be pretty similar, right? The only difference is, let's go with, let me just comment this out. If we go with this sort of example, instead of doing this join, you can say we have our selection and we've bound it. At this point, it would just be the normal pattern that you would go about with your like enter exit merge sort of pattern, right? So you could do your like something like this just to demonstrate the enter. And let me refresh this. And yep, so I am appending that data cell, and then if I set the text, it's already appended now. But if you run it from scratch, right, I've only done the enter section of this, right? You'd have to do the rest of it, and I don't want to go over all pieces of that, but the important thing here is that once you have this selection and have bound it, you can do either. You can do your normal enter exit merge, or you can do your join. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I had a question as well. I think it might have to do with something I was trying to understand earlier, which is like what exactly is being returned. And so if you select a statement, bind data to it, and then select another statement, is that data no longer bound to it, or how does that work?
So to be explicit, if you're doing a select all, it will get it will get passed down to that new selection. If you're doing a select, I believe you lose the data.
Okay.
So there's that important distinction. In terms of like how it gets passed down though, can be a bit tricky. I think actually this might have a better example off the cuff, because here, instead of this, produce object, they have a matrix. So it's a list of list.
Mhm.
And
Gotcha.
right, you have this first selection, which gets your rows, and you bind that data to your list of lists or matrix. And then in the second selection, they're doing a similar thing where they're passing in a function. And for each data element in that list of lists, it will return itself. So in this selection, at least within this data call, you still have access to this matrix. But the difference is each, you're kind of subdividing the data. So
Okay.
for that first row, your entirety of your data for that first selection is the 0, 1, 2, 3. I was a little bit rambly, but let me go back to this example, and let me comment this out and uncomment this. Here you still have access to this object in the same way that like you would here dot name. This is not doing anything, but in general in D3, if you want to set some style based on your data, you can pass in a function, and that function is expected to run on each data element in your selection. And in this case, that D would be, one data element in this list, produce list, is going to be something like this or this. So you could, if you want to set the class name to celery, right, you could do something like that. And here, this D element is equivalent to this D element. So in that regards, the data is maintained. It just happens in this case that we want to explicitly make that a list of these attributes as opposed to just an object, which won't work with join.
Gotcha. So it seems like you just have to be using select all and not select. Is that kind of okay?
Yes.
And then
Yep.
just to make sure I understand correctly at all, it's like if you do a select statement, it's returning a new selection. And if you do like data join or data join attribute style, it's returning the same selection. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what I was saying earlier, which is why these are indented differently, because these are creating new selections, whereas these are only performing operations on the existing selection without changing it.
Great, thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to try some exercises for this lab, and the way I was thinking of doing it is to break you open to breakout groups into, we'll say, groups of 3 or 4, and you can attempt this exercise 1, which starts very similarly to the example above. You have a produce produce list. But instead of these aggregate statistics, you have just a list of costs at different, very real grocery stores. And you'll notice that the length of the list might be different. You could have 4, 5, 2 elements. And I've provided this overall structure for you as well, where it's the same overall idea. You select all the rows, you bind to this produce list, you create all your table row elements, then you select all the data elements, creating a new selection. And here is where the difference is going to be. So you'll notice, once again, we're passing in a function. I've split this up into add these curly braces just because we're going to be doing a little bit more, and it's nice, I think, to divide it up amongst separate rows to keep it just a little clean. But it's effectively doing the same thing as here, where we pass in a function and it returns this list. Here, we pass in a function, and this is going to ultimately return a list, but we need to populate that on the fly. And yeah, so we'll switch to breakout rooms, and I'll give you about 4 minutes, and then we'll rejoin. I'll give you 5 minutes, and then we can rejoin.
I have a quick question. What's the goal of, like, what is the output supposed to be?
Yes, good question. So the output is intended to be exactly the same. So it's a very artificial example, but the goal is to, on the fly, calculate the minimum, the average, and the max. As
Gotcha.
opposed to
Okay, great.
here, where it's sort of pre-computed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Have the breakout rooms already started?
They've not. I don't see how
Okay.
to do it.
I don't know how either. I would help, but I can't. I'm sorry.
Here we go. And maybe I'll stop my share first. That might make it easier. We'll do 4 rooms. And the goal of the breakout rooms is that you, if you get stuck, you can discuss with the other people in your group.